Good, good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, yeah, as Andy said, I'm going to do a little warm-up act for myself, which will be half an hour of indulgence on the historical background to my story about my novel about the Spanish conquest of Mexico, called War God. In fact, the novel is one of a series of 3 novels, and I've already written the second volume of that series, which will be published next year. The first volume is already out. But what I'm going to give is the historical background to that novel, about half an hour, and then go immediately into sharing some of my new research on the sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods. So altogether, I expect to keep you occupied here for about 2 hours until about 9:15. Is that going to be too late for anybody? Is that okay? All right. And I'll be delighted to sign books and, I don't know, take photographs and do a jig or anything afterwards. It'll be my pleasure. Yeah. Okay. I'll just keep my hand up. Apparently, I'm not to move around. It causes interference, and we don't want interference. Okay, I'll stay here. And if at any point you can't hear me, please tell me. You can't hear me? No, you can't hear me. But if I put it on the stand, what? Oh dear. I have a problem with technology. But then I have to stand and look at it, right? Do I? This is the case for lapel mics.
Yes.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Okay, it's true about the interference then. All right, half an hour on the Spanish conquest of Mexico. This is where it all took place. This is Mexico as we know it today, and this was the area occupied by the Aztec Empire. I'll call them the Aztecs. That's the most common way that we know them today, but they called themselves the Mexica, and that's from that name we get the name Mexico. Their capital city was Tenochtitlan, which occupies part of the area now occupied by Mexico City. But in those days, Tenochtitlan was in a beautiful lake. It was an island on a lake, and it was approached by gigantic causeways, phenomenal feats of engineering, up to 6 miles in length. The Spanish were stunned by the beauty and achievement of this city, which far surpassed the greatest cities of Spain, in their opinion. The Aztecs were a military people, but to their disadvantage, they were a Stone Age people. They didn't know metal weapons, and of course they didn't have guns or other technological devices. They had bows and arrows, they had spear throwers called atlatls, and they had stone knives and a kind of sword which would have obsidian blades inserted into the edges of the sword. Quite a dangerous weapon, but not so formidable against Toledo steel. They had knights, eagle knights and jaguar knights. In many ways, they were rather similar to the Spanish. This was the man who sat at the top of the whole empire of terror that was the Aztec system. We know him as Montezuma. It's correctly called Moctezuma. He had a secret police force. He would carry out acts of human sacrifice deliberately to terrorize his neighbors. He was actually a very nasty guy, very, very unpleasant, and people lived in fear of him. And to look Moctezuma in the eye was to incur a death sentence. He was called the Great Speaker, but he was effectively the emperor of the Aztec Empire. The whole system of the Aztecs revolved around human sacrifice. When this pyramid, the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, the foundations of which still stand in Mexico City today, was inaugurated in the 1480s, somewhat before Moctezuma's time, the reports say that 80,000 people were sacrificed. the queues of sacrificial victims stretched back in 4 directions, more than a mile in each direction. Each one would have his or her heart cut out on the summit of the pyramid and offered to the god of war, Hummingbird, who was known by the Aztecs. His Aztec name is Huitzilopochtli. And the Aztecs, I don't want to whitewash the Aztecs. There's a kind of political correctness now that tries to cast them in a more positive light, but they were murderous thugs as far as their neighbors were concerned, and they relished the act of human sacrifice. And you can see from their own imagery the kind of pleasure that they took in this. Typically, the head of the victim would be cut off and spitted on a skull rack in the temple. The heart would be removed and placed on a burning brazier. The Aztecs were cannibals, so they favored the thigh meat of the victim, which was cooked with chilies and beans. All of this in honor of their god of war, whose name translates as Hummingbird at the left hand of the sun. This is Huitzilopochtli, and this is imagery showing him presiding over acts of sacrifice, and here, in rather ghastly, having sort of buckets of blood poured over him. Now, Moctezuma was in direct, virtually daily contact with Hummingbird, the god of war. This is one of the reasons why I wrote this as a novel, because this is kind of difficult stuff to footnote. I think it's quite well known that I'm very much in favor of the responsible use of psychedelics, but we have to accept that there's a dark side to psychedelics. If people bring darkness to the psychedelic experience, then darkness will be fed back to them. And that's what happened with the Aztecs, because Moctezuma approached his god of war in trances induced by the consumption of psilocybin mushrooms. And in these trances, he was given advice by Hummingbird, and that was almost always incredibly bad advice, which ultimately led to his downfall. I tell the story through the eyes of a number of different characters, actually 11 principal characters, but my key characters are 2 young women, Tosi, an Aztec witch, aged about 14. The Aztecs did have witches, and they persecuted them just as Europeans persecuted witches at that time. And we meet her in the fattening pen at the foot of the Great Pyramid, because the Aztecs fattened their victims for several months before cutting out their hearts. And she's an invented figure, but she's true to the historical reality. Alongside her in the fattening pen is a true historical figure whose name is Malinal, and she's the real heroine of this novel. And she's a fascinating character who emerges from the pages of history when she is handed over as a prisoner to Hernan Cortés, the conquistador, by the Maya in the early part of 1519. And the moment Malinal enters history, it's clear that she has a grudge against Moctezuma, and it's clear that she's determined to use Cortés, the conquistador, to bring Moctezuma down. History doesn't tell us why she had that grudge, but as a novelist, I'm able to give her a motive, and that motive evolves as she waits to be sacrificed in the fattening pen in Tenochtitlan. Thank goodness for Google Images. I'm able to give some little idea of Tosi here, and this is actually a painting of the historical figure of Malinal, a modern painting. And to cut a long story short, they are marched up the pyramid, but there's to be sacrificed by Moctezuma. But there is a supernatural intervention, paradoxically, by the war god himself, and they are released. And Tosi stays in Tenochtitlan to work supernatural harm against Moctezuma, and Malinal goes to the coast, seeking the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, whose return was expected. You see, the Spanish had been in Cuba and Hispaniola for 40-odd years, since 1492, let's say not 40, 30 years, since 1492, since the time of Columbus, and they'd been building up their forces there. But they knew about the mainland, but they weren't ready to take it on. But Spanish ships and Spaniards had been sighted by the Aztecs, sailing off the coast of Mexico and sometimes landing on the coast of Mexico. And this fueled a deep superstitious fear in Moctezuma, because the Spaniards, being pale-skinned and bearded, and moving around in ships that moved by themselves without paddles, fulfilled a prophecy, which was that the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who's always described as white-skinned and bearded, would return in the Aztec year one reed to overthrow a wicked king. And it just so happened that the year 1519, this is one of those extraordinary coincidences of history, was the year one reed in the Aztec calendar. And so this is why Marinal goes to the coast in the hope of encountering what she believes is a god, although she quickly discovers is not a god. The Spanish, if anything, were even worse than the Aztecs. They were a really terrible militaristic culture. They had committed a gigantic act of genocide in the islands of Cuba and Hispaniola, completely wiping out the indigenous Taino Indians, who, if they resisted conquest, were hung and burned over slow fires, or indeed fed to the dogs for the amusement. Sorry? Yeah, I'll get there, I promise. Fed to the dogs. These were dark times. I beg your pardon? I beg... What would you like, sweetness and light? Okay, so it's interesting that in 1492, the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, had given the New World to the Spanish and the Portuguese. He had drawn a line of longitude down the map. Everything east of that line of longitude would belong to Portugal. Everything west of it would belong to Spain. That's why they still speak Portuguese in Brazil today, and Spanish everywhere else. Mexico fell within the Spanish sphere of influence. And in 1513, this document was promulgated, which the Spaniards were to read to those they were about to conquer. They were to read it in Spanish or in Latin, so of course nobody could understand it, but it gave them a legal justification for what they were about to do. And in brief, it says, if you do not surrender, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them. And we shall take away your goods and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault. All of this, of course, was about gold. The Spanish were hungry for gold. Cortés famously said, we Spaniards suffer from an ailment of the heart for which the only remedy is gold. Some of the key players are Diego de Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, Hernán Cortés himself, and Cortés's psychopathic sidekick, Pedro de Alvarado. Cortés was given command of the expedition to the New World by Velázquez, but at the last minute, Velázquez changed his mind. In my story, Alvarado carries that news to Cortés, and the historical fact is that Cortés sailed in the dead of night from Cuba before Velázquez could arrest him. He sailed with 11 ships and 490 men. And they made landfall on the island of Cozumel, which is, of course, a holiday resort today. There they faced very little resistance from the indigenous Mayan tribes of Cozumel, and they had a stroke of luck. They heard that somebody who looked like Cortés, indeed was referred to by the Maya as a Castilian, was living on the mainland. And this turned out to be a shipwrecked Spaniard whose name was Jerónimo de Aguilar. He'd actually been shipwrecked 11 years before, along with 26 other Spaniards. There were a total of 26 of them. 25 had been eaten by the Maya, but Aguilar had survived. Aguilar therefore spoke fluent Maya and fluent Spanish, and he became Cortés's first interpreter in his interactions with the Maya. They sailed on from Cozumel to the Tabasco River, where Cortés intended to inflict an act of revenge on the Chontal Maya of that area, because the year before, a small Spanish fleet of just 3 ships and 100 men had taken a savage beating from the Maya, and Cortés wanted revenge for that. And interestingly, Cortés, like Moctezuma, had a supernatural advisor. He was visited by an entity that he construed to be St. Peter in dreams. St. Peter, he believed, had saved his life from a fever as a child. And St. Peter, just as the god of war urged Moctezuma onto violence, so St. Peter urges Cortés onto violence. And the idea I'm playing with in the story is that the same, because this is a story of the supernatural, is that the same demon who appears to Moctezuma as the war god takes on another disguise and appears to Cortez as St. Peter and manipulates these two men to drive them to acts of ferocity and madness and to multiply human misery, which has been the purpose of demons down the ages. So the Spanish went up the Tabasco River in longboats. They couldn't navigate up in their large craft, and they faced a gigantic Mayan army. Spaniards of the time report that they confronted 40,000 Mayans armed for battle. Remember, there were only 490 Spaniards. It seems at this point that the whole venture would come to an end, but the Spanish had some extraordinary advantages. I'm again sorry if this causes squeamishness, but I'm simply reporting the facts of the time. The Spanish had 100 dogs of war with them. These were mastiffs and wolfhounds principally, and they were trained to relish human flesh. They were armored in plate and mail. Actually, the Maya and the Aztecs did have dogs. They knew what dogs were. They had chihuahuas. But the chihuahuas did not even bark, and they were used as a food item. So confronting the Spanish war dogs, the indigenous tribes had no idea what they were dealing with, and they thought they were dragons. The other terrible instrument of war was the Spanish cavalry. Spanish only had 16 heavy horse with them, but this was the first time that a cavalry charge had ever been mounted in the New World. Horses had been extinct for 12,000 years, and the impact was utterly devastating on the Mayan forces, who thought that horse and man were one animal, a kind of hybrid entity, part deer and part human in form. And then, of course, the Spanish had their swords of Toledo steel, and they had cannon, and they had a primitive form of musket called the arquebus. So, and intense military discipline. So what should have been a complete rout of the Spanish forces turned into a rout for the Maya. The Maya surrendered, and they gave Cortez a gift. Amongst the gifts given to Cortez in the act of surrender was 20 women. And this is where my heroine, Malinal, enters history, because she was one of those women. Cortez did not immediately realize what a treasure he had been given. He was later to admit in his memoirs that, aside from God himself, it was Malinal who gave me this conquest of Mexico. But initially, he didn't understand what she had to offer him, and he gave her to one of his lieutenants as a bed slave. Spanish sailed on from the Tabasco River and made their first contacts with the Aztecs at Cuetlaxtlan. And there, Aguilar, the translator who could speak Mayan and Spanish, became redundant because the Aztecs spoke another language called Nahuatl, and Cortez was again reduced to sign language. And that's when Malinal thrust herself forward and made it clear that she could speak Maya and Nahuatl. Therefore, she could translate the words of the Aztec ambassadors from Nahuatl into Maya, and Aguilar could translate them from Maya into Spanish and reverse, and suddenly Cortez was in control of the situation again. He could speak to the people he intended to conquer. Very quickly, because Malinal was a brilliant woman, she had replaced Aguilar entirely. She learned Spanish very, very fast, and she became Cortez's sole interpreter. And she also became his mistress and the mother of his child. And a statue of Malinal stands in Mexico City to this day with the Cortez family. And she's enjoyed many different reputations throughout history, but today in Mexico she's regarded as a traitor. In fact, the word Malinchist is an insult in Mexico, and Malinal is seen as the person who handed over her country to the invaders. I hope my story has gone some way to restore her reputation, because I think she was an amazing woman, incredibly courageous, and I think her whole project was to bring down the empire of terror headed by Moctezuma, which she did succeed in doing. She couldn't have known initially that she would be replacing it with something worse. Everywhere we see images of Malinal, we see the speech glyph in front of her mouth, because that's what she was. She was the tongue of Cortez, and it was she who told him about the myths and traditions of a white-skinned, bearded god, a god of peace, who would return to abolish human sacrifice and institute a reign of peace in Mexico, and that Moctezuma was terrified of the return of this god and that Cortez could exploit it. And in case one doubts the mythology of the white-skinned, bearded stranger, one need only look at this imagery from the oldest archaeological strata in Mexico, always associated with the imagery of the feathered serpent. So Cortez was able to slot himself into prophecy and take great advantage of that in his campaign against the Aztecs. He did something quite extraordinary. There was a faction of about 100 of his 490 men who wanted to return to Cuba. Once they understood that the Aztecs could put 200,000 men in the field, a number of the Spanish wanted to go home. They didn't think they could possibly win. Cortez solved the problem by sinking his fleet. He had holes drilled in the bottom of the ships and sank them in the bay, and told his men, this is how it is, you'll either conquer or die. And they marched up into the highlands, and they were heading for a place called Tlaxcala. And they were heading for it because there was a small independent republic that had been fighting the Aztecs for 200 years. And had been used as a farm for human sacrifice by the Aztecs. But the Tlaxcalans were a military people, and Cortez figured they would be natural allies for him. The enemies of the Aztecs would, in theory, be his friends, and they would want to join him to help him overthrow Moctezuma. But that's actually not what happened initially. Xicotenca the Younger, who's another one of the heroes of my story, and again a true historical figure, was a very far-sighted man. He didn't believe any of the nonsense about Cortez being a god. He knew he was a bandit and a thief and a conqueror. And when he looked at Cortez and the Spaniards, he realized that they wouldn't stop with the Aztecs, and that they spelled the doom for the entire culture of Mexico. So rather than take the easy path and join Cortez at once, Xicotenca fought him tooth and nail for about 6 weeks and put the Spanish under tremendous pressure. And in one famous incident, a Tlaxcalan warrior actually beheaded a Spanish horse with his primitive sword, thus puncturing the myth of the supernatural nature of these creatures. Cortez resorted to terrorism, burning whole villages, throwing men and women onto pointed stakes in pits, and eventually the elders of Tlaxcala forced a surrender, and Xicotenca was obliged to become Cortez's lieutenant. It's a sign of the character of the man that 2 years later, when the city of Tenochtitlan faced its final apocalyptic fall, when it was riddled with smallpox, when the Aztecs were starving to death, that Xicotenca went to Cortez and said, you have to stop now. Enough is enough. You have to show mercy. And Cortez refused. He said, I'm not going to show them any mercy whatsoever. I'm going to wipe them out to the last man. And Xicotenca at that point walked out on Cortez. Cortez sent a team after him and hanged him from a tree. He's a hero in Tlaxcala to this day, Xicotenca. Spanish marched on to Cholula. There they conducted another massacre. There they killed 5,000 people, feeding them to the dogs, to send a message to Moctezuma. And Moctezuma got the message. When Cortez arrived on the shores of Lake Texcoco, Moctezuma was a quivering wreck, absolutely terrified. Not all of his lieutenants felt the same way, and a plan was cooked up. Moctezuma wanted to surrender to Cortez, but what was decided instead was that the Spanish would be admitted to Tenochtitlan without their Tlaxcalan allies. An encounter actually took place on the causeway between Moctezuma and Cortez, with Malinal translating. And it's interesting how the local accounts of that tell how Malinal looked Cortez straight in the eye. Looked Moctezuma straight in the eye and never lowered her eyes for a second, which was unheard of for any Aztec to do, let alone for a woman to do. So the idea was to admit the Spanish, then cut the bridges on the causeway, maroon the Spanish inside the city, and massacre them. Cortez forestalled this by taking Moctezuma hostage within 4 days of entering the city. And for the next 6 months, he ran the Aztec Empire with Moctezuma as his puppet. And he might have achieved his goal without further bloodshed had it not been for the jealousy of Diego de Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, who had by now heard of Cortez's success in Mexico. And Velázquez sent a fleet with 1,000 Spaniards, not to support Cortez, but to attack him. Velázquez couldn't bear Cortez's success. Cortez had to leave 100 men in Mexico City guarding Emperor Moctezuma, and he took 300 to the coast And he was such a brilliant military strategist that he defeated the force sent by Velázquez and absorbed those 1,000 men into his own army. Unfortunately, while that was happening, Pedro de Alvarado, who was a true psychopath, conducted a massacre in Tenochtitlan itself, and the Aztecs rose against him. And when Cortés returned to the city, those 100 Spaniards were cornered and in a desperate situation, with the whole Aztec Empire risen against them. Cortés broke into the city, he relieved the siege, he marched Moctezuma up onto the battlements to appeal for peace, and the Aztecs killed Moctezuma at that point with stones and spears. And then a terrible battle ensued. The Aztecs were determined to wipe the Spaniards out, and 4 days of very, very heavy fighting followed, and finally the Spanish realized that they had to flee the city. They witnessed 50 of their own number captured and marched up the pyramid and sacrificed to the god of war. And they did flee the city. The causeways had been cut, and these causeways eventually filled up with human bodies. Of the 1,000+ Spaniards who made their way along the causeway that night, 600 were killed by the Aztecs. 400 got to the other side, and the Aztecs could have finished them off, but they were too busy carrying out human sacrifices to do that. And the Spanish, those 400 Spaniards got away. They licked their wounds in Tlaxcala for several months, where they were given sanctuary. And then Cortés returned, and the iron has entered into his soul now. And he marches around Lake Texcoco, and one by one he picks off every single one of the Aztec allies, isolating the Aztecs in their island city, where they believe they're impregnable. But Cortés has done something that ranks alongside the feats of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He realizes if he's going to take this city, he must control the lake. In order to control the lake, he needs ships. So up in the mountains of Tlaxcala, 100 miles from Tenochtitlan, he has built a fleet of 13 ships, 13 brigantines, each capable of taking 50 men. They test them out on a lake in the mountains. They then dismantle them, place them on the shoulders of 8,000 bearers, and carry them 100 miles to the edge of Lake Texcoco, where they reassemble their ships. And they then mount cannon on the ships, and the siege of Tenochtitlan begins. And there are months of truly horrendous fighting. It has to be said that the Aztecs put up a very brave and determined resistance. The Spanish deliberately infected them with smallpox. It was the first known use of a biological weapon. They used infected blankets to bring smallpox into the city. The Aztecs had no resistance. Thousands died. And Cortés finally breaks into the city again. There's 2 more days of intense fighting, and he has won. And the Aztecs, those who are left, mourn and lament the loss of their civilization. It's a fact that the population of Mexico on the eve of the conquest was 30 million. 50 years later, it had been reduced to just 1 million. 29 million people died in the genocide that the Spanish brought with them. So from the supernatural point of view, it very much looks as though the demon who has played both these men and driven them to this terrible act of folly has won. And indeed, it's worth reflecting that the world we live in today is a direct consequence of the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Spanish conquest of Peru followed soon afterwards. The genocide of the Native American Indians of North America, the whole relationship of Europe to the so-called developing countries was forged and fashioned at this time. And how different it might have been if those two peoples had approached one another in a spirit of love and mutual tolerance and learning, how much each side had to learn from the other, and how again and again as humans we commit these terrible follies when bright prospects are held in front of us. What redeems the story for me are the honest, decent, good characters, the power of human love to survive even in the darkest of times. And I would just say in closing that much hope has recently been raised around the issue of the return of Quetzalcoatl. It's taken as a symbol for a rebirth of consciousness in the world today. I can only hope that the next time such a situation is in the offing, we do it right rather than doing it wrong. So I'll get straight on now to the sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods. And I'm going to introduce a lot of the new material that is intriguing and fascinating me at the moment, but forgive me for also going over some of the old material that first drew me into this mystery and made me feel that there is a strong possibility of a forgotten episode in human history. My wife Santha took almost all the pictures that we'll see tonight. I wouldn't be anywhere without Santha. She's been at the bottom of the ocean with me and at the top of the Great Pyramid and every adventure we've shared. I think I would have been lost in every possible way that a man can be lost if it hadn't been for Santha in my life. So I just want to thank her for her role in all of this. Back in '95, when I published Fingerprints of the Gods, it used to be said, all of us working in this field were interested in the fact that there were pyramids in many different countries around the world. And these pyramids, furthermore, seem to have more in common than just their shape. There seem to be certain ideas. This idea of the transformation of human beings into gods is very central to the pyramids of Giza. And it's also central to the pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mexico, just north of Mexico City, where we have the so-called Pyramid of the Moon and the Pyramid of the Sun, and a myth of the beginning of a world age taking place there. An old age of the world had ended and a new age began. These ideas are resonant and found in pyramids all around the world. The astronomical connection at Teotihuacan, very similar to the astronomical connection that we find in ancient Egypt. And the equinoctial alignment, for example, of the Pyramid of Kukulkan in Chichen Itza in the Yucatan. All of these things are very curious because pyramids all around the world seem to have the same set of ideas and the same connections to the heavens incorporated within them. But the view of archaeology at the time was that it's not possible for there to be any connection between the pyramids of the Old World and the pyramids of the New World, because the pyramids of Giza were built, according to Orthodox chronology, around 2500 BC. And the pyramids of Mexico, that Teotihuacan group of pyramids, really that dates to about 200 years, 300 years after Christ, maybe even a little bit later. And the Chichen Itza pyramid that we're looking at now, around about 900 to 1,000 years after Christ. So if they're separated by so much time, it must be a coincidence that they all have the same design and that they all incorporate the same features. So this was the view of archaeology, and this was one of the arguments that was given to debunk any mysterious connection between pyramids around the world. And I just want to make this point to say that really, I think archaeology is a wonderful discipline and they do incredible work, but I think they need to be more humble, and I think they need to be more provisional with regard to history and prehistory. And the further back we go, the more provisional they need to be. We shouldn't be drawing firm conclusions about the past on the basis of limited evidence, because the next turn of the archaeologist's spade can change the whole picture. And that's what's happened here at Caral, which is a large group of pyramids about 200 kilometers north of Lima in Peru, which have been excavated over the last 10 years. And companion pyramids, there's another one of the Caral pyramids, companion pyramids at Banduria, about 65 kilometers south of there. And it's now clear that these pyramids do date to the period from 2500 to 3000 BC, exactly the period that is attributed to the Giza pyramids. So the argument that the chronological separation of the pyramids means there can no longer be any connection with them falls apart in the light of this new archaeological evidence. So there's Fingerprints of the Gods, a battered, beaten-up copy of Fingerprints of the Gods. That's how I like to see it. Published in 1995, in which I argued that civilization was much older and much more mysterious than we had previously been taught. One of the magazines, one of the friends of archaeology that attacked me for suggesting that was New Scientist magazine. So I couldn't help feeling a certain warm glow when I saw this cover of New Scientist magazine in October 2013. Civilization is older and more mysterious than we thought. Are things changing? I think they are. I think they are, and I'll outline this evening some of the reasons why I think they're changing. And as I say, that will involve going over some old material, so please bear with me while I do that. I want to take you around the Giza Plateau, and here is the Great Pyramid of Giza, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. And here is the southwest corner of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And if you want to climb the Great Pyramid illegally, that's the corner that you need to go up. And if you want to climb the pyramid these days, you're going to have to do it illegally because there is no legal way to climb it. Other corners are more eroded and damaged, but there's a nice straight line, and if you're reasonably fit, you can climb up there in 25 minutes or so. There was a chap called Champion in Giza who used to run up in about 7 minutes, but it takes me about 25 to get up there. Some statistics here: this 13.1 acre footprint, 6 million tons, 481 feet high, and the angle of slope here is 52 degrees, which is exactly double the angle of slope of the internal corridors and chambers at 26 degrees. Here's the Great Pyramids towering over Giza today. The modern architecture just humbled in comparison to these majestic ancient monuments. Santa took this photograph from an Egyptian military helicopter hovering over the village of Nazlet al-Saman on the northeast of the Giza Plateau. And it's interesting that the Great Sphinx, which is 270 feet long and 70 feet high, is in this picture, but really dwarfed by the majestic scale of the monuments. That's the Sphinx there, little Sphinxy, gazing east across the Nile Valley. This photograph is from the northwest side of the Great Pyramids, and here we see the north faces of each pyramid, and we see why Egypt is the gift of the Nile, as the ancients said, because Seir Desert to the west and the lush and fertile Nile Valley below, and the Great Sphinx overlooking it all. And as we get closer, we see the true entrances of all three of the pyramids, and we see half a course of masonry is left on top of the Great Pyramid. And this is where I tell the little anecdote about my grandfather, because amongst the graffiti carved into the top of this pyramid, I found the name of my grandfather, P. Hancock, 5th of April, 1916. I couldn't be sure it was my grandfather, who was called Philip Hancock. He had been in Egypt with British forces in the First World War. He was a chaplain. But I called my dad, who had his diaries, and I asked him, look up the 5th of April, 1916. And I heard him thumbing through the pages, and finally he came back on the line, and he said, but Graham, there's just one line here. Now, I said, what does the line say? He said, climbed Great Pyramid today. The Great Pyramid stands on latitude 30 degrees north, 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. Actually, it doesn't stand exactly on 30 degrees north. There's a fraction of error. And that fraction of error would be accounted for if you were to take your latitude bearing by the effect of atmospheric refraction would throw your latitude measurement slightly off. And this is one of the reasons, amongst many, why I don't think we need aliens to explain the construction of the Great Pyramid. There are little errors involved in the Great Pyramid. And if you've got the technology to cross interstellar space, if you've got that level of technology, which is so far beyond the technology we have today, and you take it upon yourself to build a pyramid in a particular location, I think you would get the location spot on right rather than slightly wrong. It's a significant latitude, however, 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole, and this is part of the way that the pyramid speaks to the planet on which it's built. It's also just 3/60ths of a single degree off true north. And again, I think if aliens did it, they would have got it spot on. I think this whole argument that aliens, the Great Pyramid is truly the most mysterious massive monument anywhere in the world, and I've seen plenty of them. And if you had the technology to cross interstellar space, you wouldn't make these mistakes. You wouldn't get the side lengths varying by as much as 7 inches. This is human workmanship, in my view, and I think it trivializes the mystery to say, oh, I don't understand it, so it must be aliens. It is a complex piece of work, which is in many ways far ahead of what we think of as the technology of the time, but it is human workmanship. And I think a lost civilization and the legacy of a lost civilization better explains these mysteries within the human context than invoking alien interventions to explain how they got built. This is what I call the pyramid-Earth ratio. So if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure its base perimeter and multiply it by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Egyptologists know this, but they say it's a coincidence. Of course, the pyramid can't be a mathematical scale model of a hemisphere because the ancient Egyptians didn't even know we lived on a planet, never mind the scale, the dimensions of the planet. So how could they have incorporated those measures? But it turns out that the number 43,200 is not a random number. That it belongs to a sequence of numbers generated by another key motion of the Earth, and that is the precession of the equinoxes, thought to be caused by a wobble on the axis of the Earth, which changes the positions of the stars in the skies over very long periods of time, over what we might call the Great Year of just under 26,000 years, 25,920 years. Pole star right now is Polaris, but as the whole precessional cycle unfolds, sometimes the North Pole of our planet will point at empty space, and sometimes it will point at other stars, which are not Polaris. And this process is also visible on the horizon at the equinoxes, as I'll explain in a moment, where it changes the background stars that rise behind the sun. And it operates and unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. And that number, 43,200, is a multiple of 72. 72 is the heartbeat of the precessional cycle, and I looked into a whole sequence of what I call precessional numbers in Fingerprints of the Gods, which are numbers derived from and generated by the precession. So half of 72 is 36, and if you add 36 to 72, you get 108, and half of that is 54. 108 times 2 is 216, and so on and so forth. Whole sequence of numbers that can be generated by the number 72. And such numbers are found in the Mayan calendar. And they are found in myths and traditions all around the world. And I drew attention to the majestic work of Giorgio de Santillana, the professor of the history of science at MIT, and Hertha von Deschend, who made the astonishing suggestion that information about the precession of the equinoxes had been deliberately encoded in myths by what they called some almost unbelievable ancestor civilization at some time in remote prehistory, with the intention that that information should be preserved. Encoded in a good story, it doesn't matter what knowledge the storyteller has. As long as the storyteller tells the story true, that information will be carried down. And they make the case that these numbers are there to tell us about precession of the equinoxes. The Great Sphinx is part of the pattern, the precessional pattern at Giza, which has between its pores a stela of much later date, the so-called dream stela, which tells us that the Sphinx marks the splendid place of the first time, which was a concept in ancient Egyptian tradition, Zep Tepi, the time when the gods walked the earth. And this is what you see if you get up illegally on the back of the Sphinx. You see the back of the Sphinx's head here. And were you to be there at the summer solstice, the sun would be rising over here, and at the winter solstice, it would be rising over here. North of east at the summer solstice, south of east at the winter solstice. But if you get up on the back of the Sphinx on the spring equinox, when night and day are of equal length, you'll find what the Sphinx is designed to do. It is designed to marry heaven and earth on that special day. It gazes directly at the rising sun on the equinox, and it'll always do so. But what changes is the background stars that rise behind the sun, the stars that house the sun, the constellations of the zodiac. That's why we live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. We've lived in the age of Pisces for the last 2,000 years, but the age of Aquarius is indeed coming on when Aquarius will house the sun. And the constellations of the zodiac march backwards against the rising sun over the whole great year at the rate of one constellation every 2,160 years. And the process is the opposite of the annual passage through the zodiac: Leo, Cancer, Gemini, Taurus, Aries, Pisces, Aquarius, and so on and so forth. Now, it was my colleague Robert Boval, who's sitting back there, who made the fundamental breakthrough with the Great Pyramids with his book, The Orion Mystery, and the recognition that the three pyramids of Giza are a representation on the ground of the three stars of the belt of Orion. This really is a key to understanding everything about ancient Egypt. Once you get that key, and Egyptology has been very reluctant to accept it, once you get that key, everything else swings into shape. And a few years after Robert published the Orion Mystery, I had the honor to work with him on a book called Keeper of Genesis, where we deployed this diagram, which is based on computer simulations of the ancient skies and shows how the sky looked roughly between 10,000 and 11,000 BC, between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago, at dawn on the equinox, when the constellation of Leo houses the sun. And at the moment that the sun breaks the horizon, the constellation of Orion is lying due south. I mean, frankly, you'd have to be astronomically illiterate to build an equinoctial marker at Giza in 2,500 BC in the shape of a lion, for that was the age of Taurus, and you would ideally build it in the form of a bull, not of a lion. So there seems to be some kind of effort to use precessional astronomy and monumental architecture to draw attention to this epoch that we call in our calendar between 10,000 and 11,000 BC. And interestingly, a whole range of sites around the world, of sacred sites, are laid out significant degrees of longitude apart from Giza, and those degrees of longitude respond to precessional numbers. We're being told that something happened at a particular time. Astronomy and architecture are being used to tell us that. So it's interesting, if we go to Tiruvannamalai in southern India, we find this sacred red hill. And the legend is that the ground near it is not at all touched by the four oceans that become agitated at the close of the Yuga. The Yuga is a world age, when the annihilation of all living beings takes place. All the future seeds are certainly deposited here. Brahmins who resort to the foot of that mountain are called by me after the deluge, and I make them study the Vedas. In other words, this is being typecast as a place of refuge from a global cataclysm, from the flood, where the wisdom of the past age will be passed forward to the future age. And the temple that stands on at the foot of the Red Hill today, Tiruvannamalai, is an intriguing place, and there are still sadhus who come there from all over India. But what's interesting is that in the Tiruvannamalai area, there are indeed submerged ruins underwater. Here at Pumpahar, for example, a gigantic U-shaped structure. And here at Mahabalipuram, where we find the famous rock-hewn temples of Mahabalipuram, Santa and I were told by Tamil fishermen that there was a city underwater. And we went to the Scientific Exploration Society in Britain and managed to put together an expedition to go and check out what the fishermen were telling us. As you can see, it was a very high-tech expedition. And off we went, and we dived in the bay off Mahabalipuram, and lo and behold, it turned out that what the fishermen were telling us was absolutely correct, and that there is indeed a city underwater, and that this city extends as much as 5 kilometers out from the shore. It became impossible for archaeology to deny it because that bay was emptied during the Boxing Day tsunami, and many people saw these ruins for themselves before the sea came rushing back in. If we continue along this longitude grid, we come to Angkor in Cambodia, which is exactly 72 degrees of longitude east of Giza. And there are 72 major temples at Angkor. I'm fully aware that these temples were built around 1150 AD, but I believe they're the latest incarnations of much earlier sacred sites on the location that we know as Angkor today. And here we see Angkor Wat itself. And by the way, Angkor has a meaning in ancient Egyptian. It means life to the Horus. And here is the causeway running east-west through the center of Angkor Wat. And if you position yourself on that causeway at dawn on the spring equinox and look east, you find that something very similar to what happens at Giza is taking place. There's the Sphinx looking at the rising sun at dawn on the spring equinox. And here's what happens at Angkor as the sun slowly rises up the central tower and eventually positions itself perfectly on top of the central tower. And again, you know, you have a moment of epiphany that this is what Angkor is all about, that it is a place as above, so below, that will unite heaven and earth on that special day, and that it is speaking the language of precession. I got into a lot of trouble for the so-called Draco correlation at Angkor, that the principal temples appear to be laid out in the pattern of the northern constellation Draco, the dragon, which is seen in many cultures as a serpent. And the principal imagery at Angkor is of serpents, particularly Vasuki, a famous serpent of Indian myth. And it seems to me that the correlation is actually quite close. But what's eerie about it is that it only works on the spring equinox in 10,500 BC, the same time that the correlation works at Giza. So why am I showing a picture of the Hoover Dam? Well, it turns out that there's a star map in the Hoover Dam, and that star map freezes the skies above the Hoover Dam on the date of the dam's completion. And the artist responsible, Oscar Hansen, stated that he believed that in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. I mean, in a sense, who gives a damn when the Hoover Dam was built? But what this tells us is that it's not an alien idea in our culture today to use architecture and the stars to send a message to the future. You don't want to send a message 10,000 years into the future written in the language of the day. Nobody may be able to read it. The document may not even survive. You want a language that's universal, that any developed human culture will be able to grasp and understand, and that is the language of astronomy and architecture. The ancient Egyptians, this is the pharaoh Seti I showing his young son Ramesses II, a list of all the pharaohs who ruled before their time, had a concept of their own history, and they believed that it went back far before the first dynasty, so-called, far before 3000 BC. And these king lists, which are used by Egyptologists to derive the orthodox chronology of Egypt, annoyingly for Egyptologists, don't stop at 3000 BC, but go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years into the past. So it's interesting that behind the Temple of Seti I is this huge megalithic structure of completely different character, which was excavated from beneath 50 feet of silt, the so-called Osirion. Maybe it wasn't built by Seti I. Maybe it belongs to an earlier period, and maybe these gigantic megaliths weren't always moved in the way that Egyptologists want them to have been moved. Maybe there was a kind of psychic magic being deployed. Maybe the myths and traditions that speak of the priests singing the blocks into place have something solid to them. Certainly there are many gigantic megalithic structures at Giza, and it's long seemed to me that these belong to a different epoch from 2500 BC. And that we may be looking at two-phase construction, that the ancient Egyptians may have worked on those temples and may have moderated them and overbuilt them and built around them, but may not have been responsible for the original megalithic core. This becomes all the more pointed when we realize that the blocks in these temples were excavated from around the core body of the Sphinx. Therefore, if there's any argument that the Sphinx is older than 2500 BC, it follows that these temples are older as well. And this is where the work of John Anthony West and Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University that I featured in Fingerprints of the Gods is so important, because they have shown that the Sphinx was the subject of thousands of years of erosion by heavy, heavy rainfall. And we don't get that kind of rainfall in Giza in the last 5,000 years. So geologically, the Sphinx appears to be much older than 2500 BC. Well, the killer argument that Egyptology gave back to that when John West and Robert Schoch planted this bomb under the comfortable bottoms of Egyptology, the killer argument was that the Sphinx can't be 12,000 years old. It cannot be, because if a culture was capable of creating the Sphinx 12,000 years ago, there would be other big monuments around the world that are also 12,000 years old. Mark Lehner famously said, "Show me the potsherd that's been left behind by that civilization." There's none. So the geology has to be wrong. The Egyptology must be right. The Sphinx must date to 2,500 BC. Well, what has thrown a huge spanner in the works of that argument is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Really not even very far from the Sphinx. And Göbekli Tepe, as I'm sure Andy has been discussing earlier today, is 12,000 years old. And what's rather special about it is that the site was deliberately buried and shut off. For the last 10,000 years, that site has been pristine. No culture has been marching over it and perhaps interposing carbon from a later period, because you can't date stone. You can only date organic material found associated with the stone. And this is why it's so clear that Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old, because there is no contamination from later cultures. It's a time capsule. This is the general appearance of Göbekli Tepe. And I'm here talking to Klaus Schmidt, who is the lead archaeologist who excavated Göbekli Tepe, is in the process still of excavating Göbekli Tepe. And what he's telling me rather emphatically is that the stuff they've dug up at the moment is just 1/20th, perhaps even only 1/50th of what is still under the ground. That they've done ground-penetrating radar over the site, and these few stone circles that we look at today are just a tiny fraction of what remains to be excavated. And you know what? He's not actually intending to excavate all of it. He's going to run out of money in the next few years, and he's probably going to wrap up the excavation. I do understand the conservation argument to not excavating all of this site, but this site is, in my opinion, the single most important archaeological site in the world right now. And I think it justifies a full and complete excavation so that we can get to the bottom of it. Because frankly, hunter-gatherers don't just wake up one morning and decide to create a site with 50-ton megaliths. They don't wake up one morning and suddenly have the skills to mobilize, organize, feed, and water hundreds of men to cut and manipulate stone, to lift that stone into place. There has to be a background to this. And that background, I personally think, is likely to be a lost civilization, the survivors of a lost civilization settling at Giza. Andy may have a different view, but that's the view that I hold. Here's the unfinished pillar, which was not ever removed from the quarry because a fault was found in the rock. But this one would have weighed 50 tons if fully raised up. I think what Göbekli Tepe does is it raises question marks over megalithic sites virtually everywhere else in the world. Like these extraordinary megaliths at Baalbek in the Lebanon. They've been handed to Rome because there's a Roman temple of Jupiter on top of them. But maybe the Romans did build the temple of Jupiter, but were not responsible for the megaliths. Maybe the megaliths are from a much earlier period. And if we look at the general form of Göbekli Tepe, it's really astonishingly similar to the megalithic temples of Malta, such as Menidra that we're looking down on here. Now, the Maltese temples are slotted in by archaeology between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, 3,000 and 4,000 BC. They're considered amongst the oldest megalithic temples anywhere in the world. But that is not a date that threatens history. If you can have megaliths being organized by a Neolithic agricultural society in that period. What's much more threatening to history is the idea of 12,000-year-old megaliths. But I think what Göbekli Tepe does is it means we need to look again at the dating of all sites like this. Because unlike Göbekli Tepe, the Maltese temples have never been a time capsule. They have been contaminated by later cultures. Is it possible that the carbon dating record is wrong? Is it possible that the temples of Malta, like this Hypogeum, which is an amazing underground temple, should be on anybody's bucket list in Malta, that they may be much older than 5,000 years ago? And maybe these goddess figures that were found in the Hypogeum and that have therefore also been dated to 5,000 years old, maybe they're much older. Maybe they could even be as old as the Upper Paleolithic, like other goddess figures dating back 35 or 40,000 years. Why should the goddess figures of Malta be just 5,000 years old, because that comfortably fits into the framework of history that the temples are said to occupy. And there's red ochre paint on the ceiling and walls of the hypogeum. And here, a friend and colleague of mine, Anton Mifsud, who's the chief pediatrician at the main hospital in Valletta and a gifted amateur archaeologist, has proved a thorn in the flesh of Maltese archaeology, because he has exposed a scandal, which is that there was once a painting of an animal figure on the walls of the hypogeum. In fact, it's documented in a number of books. It's documented in David Trump's book, one of the fundamental archaeological texts about Malta. But that bison bull, a hybrid creature that was half bison and half bull, cannot be found on the walls of the hypogeum anymore. And the reason it can't be found was that it was scrubbed off by the director of the Maltese Museums, F.S. Malia. He actually deliberately removed it from the walls because it suggested that the hypogeum might belong to the Upper Paleolithic rather than to the Neolithic. So I'm sitting in these so-called cart ruts with Anton Mifsud. And these cart ruts, if that's what they are also thought to date from the megalithic period in Malta. But the unfortunate fact is that they continue underwater to depths of 110 feet beneath the water in areas that have been submerged for more than 12,000 years. If we go further west, we come to the Balearic Islands and the very interesting island of Menorca, which has an extensive megalithic culture of its own. And here are the T-shaped megaliths of Göbekli Tepe, and here are the almost identical T-shaped megaliths of Menorca. Again, I want to raise the question, have the Menorcan megaliths, which are thought to be only 3,000 or 4,000 years old, have they been misdated because of contaminated carbon? And are we, in fact, looking at a much older site here than we think? If we cross the Mediterranean from Menorca, we come to North Africa. And it's interesting that many ancient maps show huge lakes present in the Sahara Desert. The last time that there were lakes present in the Sahara Desert was during the last ice age. And what all these maps have in common is that they are copies of older source maps, now lost to us. And I went into this whole issue of the maps at great length in Fingerprints of the Gods. Here's our beautiful planet as it looks today. But back during the Ice Age, we had ice caps 2 miles deep sitting on top of North America and sitting on top of Northern Europe. And all that ice, of course, was frozen water that had come out of the oceans. Therefore, sea level was 400 feet lower than it is today. This is the world as we know it, and this is the world of the Ice Age, with substantial differences. No Red Sea, no Arabian Gulf, Sri Lanka joined to India, vastly extended Southeast Asia, Australia joined to New Guinea, and so on and so forth. 10 million square miles of land that was above water then is underwater today. And that's why it's very interesting to look again at the much derided Piri Reis map, the map of 1513, created by a Turkish admiral called Piri Reis. Now, the reason he made this map, and only a fragment of it has survived, it was once a world map, he tells us in his own handwriting on the map that he had come across a cache of ancient maps, actually more than 100 ancient maps, which he thought had originally come from the Library of Alexandria. And these ancient maps were in such a fragile state, so worm-eaten, so falling apart, so crumbling away, that he decided to preserve the information on them by consolidating everything in them into his world map. And the fragment of his map that has survived shows us the west coast of Africa, the east coast of South America, and it shows us off the coast of North America this very interesting island here, roughly in the location occupied by the Grand Bahama Banks today. That island no longer exists. It did exist during the Ice Age, but if we take a close-up look at it, we can see that running up the middle of the island is a long row of megaliths. And those megaliths are just identical to the now submerged so-called Bimini Road. Of course, archaeologists say that the Bimini Road is a natural phenomenon. I don't really care whether it's natural or not. I think what's interesting is that it's documented above water on a map based on much older source maps now lost to us. This suggests that somebody was mapping the world when the Bimini Road was above water, i.e. more than 12,000 years ago, i.e. a lost civilization. The Piri-Reis map also controversially shows Antarctica. And this is how Antarctica looks today, but this is how it looked on honest maps of the early 1800s, because our civilization didn't discover Antarctica until 1818. So if you're an honest map maker and you are drawing a map of the world, you leave a gap where Antarctica is in 1800 because you don't know that it exists. So it's a great puzzle that Antarctica shows up again and again on many much older maps, maps from the 15, 14, 1600s. And again, these maps are based on older source maps, now lost to us. They seem to be mapping the world as it looked during the last ice age. Look at this little island off the coast of Ireland here, called High Brazil. Such an island did exist 12,000 years ago when sea level was hundreds of feet lower. And the greatly extended coast of Southeast Asia doesn't look like Southeast Asia in the 1500s or today, but does look a lot like Southeast Asia during the Ice Age. And while we're on the subject of Southeast Asia, I want to draw attention to another extraordinary site, which I will be visiting in early December. And it is called Gunung Padang, and it is in West Java in Indonesia, quite near the city of Bandung. And Gunung Padang has been known about for a long time. It was discovered in the early 1900s, and it has been dated to between 3,000 and 4,000 years old, which doesn't threaten the mainstream model of history at all. You can have a megalithic site between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. But here again, one of those annoying geologists has come up with some contrary information. And his name is Danny Hillman, and it's Danny who's invited me to go to Indonesia in early December, where his team will be revealing their full findings. He works for the Indonesian government, and he has been conducting a site survey at Gunung Padang. And that site survey has gone on for 5 years. And what he says is that Gunung Padang is older than 9,000 years and could be up to 20,000 years. It's a strong case, but not an easy case. We're up against the world's belief. In other words, again, as Robert Schoch found when he confronted the mainstream paradigm, there's a reference frame of how history should unfold. And if you have evidence that contradicts that reference frame, it's very difficult to get that evidence accepted. In the case of Göbekli Tepe, they've had to accept it. But it's astonishing how little mainstream archaeology is actually saying about Göbekli Tepe. I mean, this incredible site is really not getting the coverage and attention that it deserves. And now, in Indonesia, we have another site where, again, the suggestion is that the site is much older and has been radically misdated by archaeology. So this is what Gunung Padang looks like. It's made of these hexagonal basalt blocks. And I want to take you over here to Ponape, which is, again, on the processional grid, because structures made in exactly the same way are found on Ponape as well. And indeed, pyramid-shaped hills, rather like the artificial pyramid-shaped hill at Gunung Padang, is found at Ponape. And this is the famous site of Nan Madol, made of these identical basalt blocks that we found at Gunung Padang. And it's thought to be only about 800 years old, based on radiocarbon of organic materials found around the site. But the problem is that the site continues underwater. You can just dive down and keep on going, down and down and down. And eventually, around about 100 feet under the waves, you come to these huge pillars standing up from the seabed, some of which have fallen. And like this one here, which bears a striking resemblance to the megalithic pillars on the island of Tinian, not very far away. And again, what I'm saying is, this is 110 feet underwater. It was last above water more than 12,000 years ago. It raises the possibility that other megalithic sites have also been radically misdated. This is a map of Japan made in 1424. And it shows the 3 main islands of Japan, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, as one landmass. And it shows a deep inlet here and another deep inlet there. And that's actually exactly how Japan looked about 12,400 years ago, when the three islands were one landmass, and when there was a deep inlet here and here, around what is now the island of Shikoku. So let's go diving off Japan. These megalithic pillars of the island of Yonaguni are regarded as totally natural by mainstream archaeology. They have to be natural because they've been underwater for 12,000 years, and mainstream archaeology says there was no culture capable of architecture on this scale 12,000 years ago. This is how they're situated, against the edge of a huge rocky outcrop. And the suggestion is that they just kind of fell into place there, perfectly, without breaking. They just situated themselves there. But if we swim around to the side of this rocky outcrop, we come to the famous terraces of Yonaguni. And these, again, are said by archaeology to be totally natural and not man-made in any way, because there was no culture 12,000 years ago capable of creating a monument on this scale. This is the way the argument works. That the sea beating against this rocky outcrop selectively removed the softer layers and left the harder layers in place, and that's why we get this stepped appearance. Well, if there was something to that argument, then I would want to see the rubble down here, because there's a big drop-off down here. There's the terraces, and the drop-off actually has at the bottom of it a perfectly manicured path with all the rubble gathered to the side of the path, and indeed with drainage, with gutters running alongside the path. And if we continue our exploration of Yonaguni, we find this spooky face underwater with two eyes, a nose, and a mouth gazing perfectly due south. And there are pupils in the eyes. And the head of the face is nicely demarcated from the rocky outcrop out of which it was cut. And if you look closely, you can see the remnants of a headdress on top of this figure here. I'm absolutely certain that this is the work of man and not the work of nature. And if we pull back further, we find again one of these avenues with gutters alongside and what appears to be a sort of ceremonial plaza. But this is the underwater site in Japan that really settles it for me. This is off the island of Okinawa, about 40 miles west of Okinawa, off the Kerama group of islands. And it's a series of stone circles. Some of them are very small. They're actually river stones, and they appear in some way to be cemented to the seabed. But some of them are very, very large. And they're not built in the way of a megalithic circle. They're actually cut out of the bedrock. And I have not been able to find any geologist who could tell me a natural process that could have cut this out, because the scale is really quite enormous. There's the central upright and the surrounding spiral of megaliths of one of the circles. And again, if we look closer, 110 feet beneath the waves, the central upright, the outer curve is matched by the inner curve of this outer upright here. Not the work of nature, not at all. Let's hop over now to Easter Island, also on the precessional grid. But Easter Island is the exception that proves the rule, because Easter Island today, what's left of Easter Island, that little bit that's called Easter Island today, is actually not on the grid. It's about 70 miles off the grid. But interestingly, if you wind back time to 12,000 years ago and earlier, when sea level was much lower, you find that Easter Island was part of a gigantic archipelago of seamounts which stuck above the waves, and the largest part of that archipelago was precisely on the 216-degree line of the precessional grid. So Easter Island is a remnant of something much older. And is it possible that the statues of Easter Island have been misdated, have been misunderstood? They're thought to be usually not more than 800 years old as well. Is it possible that they might be much older than that? One thing that suggests it is that in a number of cases, the statues are raised up on these rather poorly built platforms. And it's clear that the platforms belong to a later period than the statues. Why is it clear? Because we can see that the head, a very ancient eroded head of a statue, has actually been used as one of the blocks in the construction of this wall. Therefore, it follows that the wall is younger than the statues. Is it possible that a later culture came along and found the megalithic ruins of Easter Island and tampered with them and did some work with them, and that we are dating everything to the work of the later culture rather than to the work of the original megalithic culture. And it's here that Professor Robert Schoch, who did the incredible work on the Sphinx, has come up with a new and very important insight. This is Rano Raraku Quarry. Santa and I have been there many times since the early 1990s. It's an amazing place, very spooky and wonderful place to spend time. And you might imagine that these statues are just buried a few feet under the ground, but Thor Heyerdahl, who I had the privilege of knowing, proved that wrong back in the 1950s when he excavated the statues. And what he shows, that's Thor there in his blue safari suit. And what he shows is that the statues are they actually go 30 feet under the ground. And what Robert Schoch has done is he's studied this infill, and he's found that it is sedimentation, that these statues have been submerged by sedimentation. They've been covered by sedimentation, and you don't get 30 feet of sedimentation in 700 or 800 years. You need to have thousands of years to get that level of sedimentation on Easter Island. Something else as well, these statues all have arms and hands with rather long fingers. And here you can see, there's the fingers and hands of the Easter Island statue, and interestingly, the Göbekli Tepe pillars have hands, arms, and fingers as well. You can see it more clearly in this slide. The crooked elbow and the fingers across the belly, very, very similar to the appearance of the Easter Island statues. And indeed, another statue from the Göbekli Tepe area, from Urfa, dating about 1,000 years later than Göbekli Tepe, shows that same hand posture across the belly. There are some excellent megalithic walls on Easter Island, and this is one of them, again with an ancient sunken Easter Island statue beside it. Perhaps it was originally placed on top of that wall and fell off it. And if we look at the construction of that wall, we can see it's very finely done and rather similar to this megalithic wall in Peru at a place called Silustani near Puno in Peru, close to Lake Titicaca. And again, if we go here, we can see that there's a kind of jigsaw puzzle pattern. You can see that little piece inserted there in this Easter Island wall, and you have exactly the same thing happening at Silustani. There's great similarities of architecture between these two walls. And again, it was Thor Heyerdahl who first suggested that whoever built the megaliths of the Andes may have been responsible for the original megalithic layer at Easter Island. And here's the famous site of Sacsayhuaman in the Andes, just an extraordinary place to go. I mean, this is just a tiny fraction of a wall, hundreds of feet long, where these huge megalithic blocks weighing 100, 150 tons each are slotted together in a massive, ambitious, three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, all the edges seeming almost to melt and flow into place. Mainstream says this is the work of the Incas. And the Incas were a relatively recent culture. In fact, they dated from about the same period as the Aztecs, roughly from 1300 to 1500. And they were brought down by the Spanish. The Inca Empire was only 200 years old when the Spanish arrived. But everything that you see in the way of architecture across huge swathe of the Andes is attributed without question to the Incas by mainstream archaeology. So you go to Sacsayhuaman and they will tell you that the Incas built this. And they'll also tell you that the Incas built this very different style of architecture that we find actually just opposite those megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman, cut from solid rock. And that the Incas built this amazing little rock-hewn shrine. Look at the perfection of that rock cutting there. Some horrendous vandal at the beginning of the 20th century, or in the 20th century when they were building the railway to Machu Picchu, came along and drilled a hole in here and planted dynamite in this. Tried to blow it up because they thought there might be treasure in it. So we're looking at what's left of it. And if we step back, we can see that there's a beautiful rock-cut wall on the side here. And there's that little shrine. And then off here, there's a very inferior piece of architecture, which looks like completely different work. But all of this, according to the mainstream model, is supposed to be the work of the Incas. As in, is this, now, okay, this little terrazzo down here, this is this little mosaic, this is modern, okay, this is 20th century, fine. But everything else we're looking at in this picture, this one and this one, is supposed to have been done by the Incas. So those very same masons who made this fantastic sheer megalithic wall are also said to have made this horrible, messy little wall over here. How much sense does that make, really? When we get these radically different architectural styles, doesn't it make sense to consider the possibility they might have been made by different peoples? Maybe the Incas found this stuff and overbuilt it and built around it and adopted it in some way. Yeah, look at this on the corner here, quite apart from the Coca-Cola stand. This is supposed to be Inca work, this is supposed to be Inca work, and this is supposed to be Inca work. Well, I've met a fascinating researcher in the Andes called Jesus Gamarra, whose family has been studying these monuments for the last 100 years. His dad, Alfredo Gamarra, was a great expert on the monuments of the Andes, and the Gamarra family are, in fact, descended from the Incas, which they take great pride in. So you would think that they would have an investment in saying, yeah, the Incas built everything. But the result of their century of work, Jesus Gamarra is now 77 years old himself, the result of their combined century of work is that they've concluded that only a tiny fraction of what we see in the Andes is the work of the Incas, and that there are at least two much earlier cultures whose works have been overbuilt by the Incas and then handed over to the Incas by modern archaeology. So there I am with Jesus Gamarra, looking at what he regards as the earliest layer of construction, and he doesn't think it's hewn out of solid rock. He thinks that there was some system for softening the rock, perhaps using heat, and that these are more the impression of molds into that softened rock, and he doesn't find any tool marks which suggest that it's been cut out. And this kind of astonishing thing, this has actually fallen away here from the side. There was this little narrow stairway, and at the bottom of it down here is a hole in the ground, now filled in by the Peruvian government, which is said to be a tunnel that leads all the way to the Coricancha in the heart of Cusco. So Jesus is saying that this kind of stuff, this stuff is the earliest layer. He dates it back tens of thousands of years, actually. And then this he puts at about 12,000 plus years ago, the work of a megalithic culture, but again commanding techniques that we don't fully understand today. I mean, go figure how these three-dimensional 100-ton jigsaw puzzles were made. You can't get a sheet of paper between the joints, and they just seem to melt and flow and fit together. Not a single stone is the same size as another one. How could anybody set out deliberately to make the architecture so difficult for themselves? Everything is incredibly, overwhelmingly complicated, and yet there it stands. Somebody did this. There I am as a younger man standing in front of one of those gigantic stones. And associated with them, you find vitrification of stone, definite signs of vitrification. Huge heat has been applied to these stones, and these astonishing precision-cut channels. This is the island of the moon, sacred to the Incas. And this was the place where the virgins who would marry the Inca was the name of the king, from whose number would be selected the wife of the king were kept. So this was an incredibly important site to the Incas. You could imagine that they did their best work here. And that's the suggestion. This is the best Inca work. And everything else we're seeing isn't Inca at all. It's pre-Inca. It's much older. We need to rewrite the history of the Andes entirely. Places like Ollantaytambo, with these huge megalithic blocks. And there we find on the wall at Ollantaytambo the imagery of stepped pyramids. And actually we do find a stepped pyramid in the Andes at Tiwanaku in Bolivia. It's called the Acapana Pyramid. And this enclosure is called the Calasasilla. And Tiwanaku is thought to date again by the mainstream. It's older than the Incas, but it's thought to date about 200-300 years after Christ. There's a strong argument that Tiwanaku also is much older, and part of that argument depends on the gateway of the sun and the suggestion there's another motion of the Earth which changes the solstitial rising points of the sun over long periods of time, and the suggestion that the astronomy of the Colossaea suggests that the Colossaea was originally laid out around 10,000 BC. Huge blocks of stone up there at 14,000 feet above sea level. Let's take a closer look at this one here, which is just mind-boggling, actually. I mean, mind-boggling to move something on that scale anywhere, but to do it 14,000 feet above sea level absolutely beggars belief. And then we find all of these beautifully, almost machine-like pieces of stone, which almost feel when you study them as though they had metal parts that were fitted into them, and the metal parts aren't there anymore. They seem like the end blocks of something, almost like a piece of machinery. It's a really very mysterious place, Tiwanaku. There's these H-shaped blocks, and I just want to draw attention to the fact that the H motif appears regularly at Göbekli Tepe. Of course, it didn't mean H like it means to us in our alphabet, but it's interesting that the same symbol that we see as an H shape also occurs at Tiwanaku. And this is a place called Cotimbo in the Andes, quite near Lake Titicaca. Again, it's all given to the Incas. It has these amazing towers on top of it. And the towers, when you get closer, are fantastic works of architecture for a start, and turn out to have animal figures carved into them. And I'm not going to make a big deal of this. I just want to draw attention to some curious similarities, some stronger than others. Some of the similarities are not so great. Some are much stronger. Like the Göbekli Tepe figures, pillars, many of them have animal figures carved on the side. Here, the penis of this animal, and here at Cotimbo, a very similar posture is found on that creature. The similarities here with the curving of the tail of a leonine creature that we find at Göbekli Tepe and Cotimbo. And this weird creature from Göbekli Tepe and its counterpart at Cotimbo. And at Göbekli Tepe, you have a salamander, and almost designed in exactly the same way a salamander at Cotimbo, serpents at Cotimbo, serpents at Göbekli Tepe. This is the Temple of the Moon near Sacsayhuaman. That's a serpent with a large head. It's almost more like a newt or a sperm than a serpent. And that same kind of serpent is found on a pillar at Göbekli Tepe with the sinuous body of the serpent and that huge head, more like a sperm or a newt than a serpent. And that's the front of that pillar. There's those serpent heads. And if we go to the front of the pillar, you can see the serpent heads with their bodies down the side. And then there's this little figure in the middle, which again I see strikingly similar to these little figures from Cotimbo. And here in Tiwanaku, that figure, that whole statue with the serpents on the side, and the figure has hands laid very like the hands of this pillar from Tiwanaku, and that pillar also has serpents along the side of it. Bearded human head there, by the way. I'll come to that. These are the famous statues of Tiwanaku. Again, the hands are in that familiar posture. What they're holding, ancient aliens would say that's ray guns from outer space. Well, no, I'm sorry, they're not ray guns. There's a bit of a segue here to another interest of mine, but these are actually snuff trays for inhaling dimethyltryptamine, DMT, the most powerful hallucinogen known to man. And it speaks of a connection between Tiwanaku and the Amazon. Now, this is the work of Dr. Manuel Torres, an ethnobotanist, and it's now accepted that he's right. Actually, you can see this on the plaques at Tiwanaku itself. They accept that what they're holding are snuff trays, very similar to ancient snuff trays from the Amazon jungle and used to snuff the powdered seeds of an Adenanthera colubrina. So let's just quickly visit the Amazon and remind ourselves of the astonishing journey of Francisco de Orellana, a Spanish conquistador, who went hunting in a small boat up here in December 1541, but didn't reckon with the current of the Amazon River. In August 1542, he ended up in the Atlantic Ocean. He traversed the entire length of the Amazon, and he reported the existence of huge cities in the Amazon. And forever afterwards, he's been regarded as a liar who was simply trying to glorify himself by claiming that he'd seen amazing magical things in the Amazon. How could there be cities in the Amazon? The Amazon is a pristine jungle, the haunt of hunter-gatherers. You don't find any cities there. Well, the tragic clearances of the Amazon are changing that picture. We now know that there were huge cities in the Amazon, and that Francisco Orellana was right, and that their inhabitants were wiped out by smallpox brought by the Spaniards. And something else in the Amazon is this amazing soil called terra preta, the black soil, which you find dotted in certain areas around the Amazon. It's been studied by scientists. Turns out it's a man-made soil filled with bacteria and biochar, and it constantly regenerates itself. It's incredibly fertile to this day, but it's been discovered to be more than 11,000 years old. Are we looking at the remains of a lost civilization of the Amazon? Is the Amazon like a desert, like the ocean, a place where archaeologists don't go, which is hiding the story of the human past? And I think this is a very real possibility and has to be considered seriously, because emerging from the cleared Amazon jungle are these huge geoglyphs and earthworks, and indeed even stone circles, megalithic circles are being found. This is in Brazil, in the Amazon. A word on the ethnopharmacology of the Amazon. Ayahuasca, the deeply visionary brew of the Amazon, which I've written a great deal about in other books, is actually quite a complicated piece of pharmacology. The active ingredient is the dimethyltryptamine, the DMT, that's contained in these leaves. But you cannot normally access DMT orally. There's an enzyme in our stomachs called monoamine oxidase that turns off DMT on contact. You can snuff it and smoke it, but you can't drink it. It's just switched off by monoamine oxidase. There's 150,000 different species of plants and trees in the Amazon, but at some remote time in the past, someone discovered that this one, the ayahuasca vine, contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor and allows the DMT in the leaves, when cooked together with the vine, to produce an orally active brew. And interestingly, the tree of life of ancient Egypt has recently been identified by my friend Dennis McKenna, the brother of Terence McKenna, and Dennis is an ethnopharmacologist. And he points out that the tree of life on which we see the god Thoth writing the immortal name of the pharaoh Seti I, that the tree of life is Acacia nilotica, and Acacia nilotica contains large quantities of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, in its bark. By the way, we all have DMT in our bodies. It's a natural brain hormone produced in the pineal gland, but normally we generate it in subpsychedelic quantities. It's quite a feat of chemistry to get the DMT out of the bark of Acacia nilotica. But where do we get the word chemistry from? What was the ancient name of Egypt, if not Alkemt? What did the Arabs call Egypt? The ancient name of Egypt was Kemet. The Arabs called Egypt Alkemt, from which we get alchemy, and the ancient Egyptians have lent their name to the origins of chemistry. I have no doubt that they were able to free DMT from the bark of Acacia nilotica. And this kind of relief, where we see the initiate connected to a star in the sky through the third eye, through the pineal gland, seems to hint at a connection. So I'm very near the end of this presentation now, and I just want to go back to this diagram involving the Sphinx, Orion, Draco, this huge project to use precession and architecture to draw attention to a date that can be pinned down between 10,000 and 11,000 BC. Are we being told that something of great significance for the world happened in this period? That's a hypothesis. Could there be something happened then that the ancients wanted to tell us about, that changed everything, that changed the game? Something perhaps that led to the destruction of a great global civilization, and something on a scale that would justify the initiation of gigantic architectural projects around the globe to mark and commemorate it. And that's something we now know is a comet. And what I'm showing here is comet Shoemaker-Levy 9, which many of us remember from 1994. Shoemaker-Levy 9 collided with Jupiter. And it was a spectacular series of impacts. The comet was broken into multiple fragments, like just a gigantic lethal freight train whizzing through the solar system. And Jupiter's gravity drew it in, and the comet exploded spectacularly on Jupiter. If that comet had not been drawn in by Jupiter, if it had come into the inner solar system, if it had hit the Earth, none of us would be here today. The Earth would have been sterilized by those impacts, which is a good reason to say thank you, Jupiter. We really owe a lot to Jupiter. In fact, arguably, there would be no life on planet Earth were it not for that gigantic guardian of our planet, circling in the outer solar system and drawing in lethal comets and destroying them. The life could not have existed if Jupiter were not there to protect the Earth from these horrendous impacts. But occasionally, a comet gets through. And we now know, it's been an argument since 2007, but the evidence has become more and more firm. And really, it's no longer an argument anymore. It's been through the mill of scholarly argument, and it's accepted. A giant fragmenting comet did hit the Earth around 10,900 BC. In fact, 10,980 BC, to be exact, 12,980 years ago. And another mystery has been solved by this, and that mystery was called the Younger Dryas. You see, just when the Earth was coming out of the last ice age, about 13,000 years ago, it was suddenly plunged back into a 1,000-year deep freeze. And that 1,000-year deep freeze has been known for a long time as the Younger Dryas, but nobody understood what caused it. Now we get it. The comet impact threw a huge amount of dust into the upper atmosphere, cloaked the entire Earth in dust, shut off the sun's rays for 1,000 years, and caused that deep freeze. The new evidence that's emerging is that at least some fragments of the worst impacts were in North America and Canada, and some fragments of the comet, it seems, actually hit the ice cap, what was left of the ice cap at that time, and in addition caused devastating floods, massive outburst floods. These floods have traditionally been attributed to the bursting of glacial lakes. It now looks much more likely, and I want to cite the work of Randall Carlson here, it now looks much more likely that these massive floods in that period just after 13,000 years ago were caused by the vaporization, the liquefaction of the ice cap as gigantic fragments of comet smashed into it. And this is just following the scientific argument. They go back and forth, but they're getting it now. A comet did wipe out the first North American prehistoric humans. Ice core data suggests a cosmic impact killed off the Clovis people. I would say this is the smoking gun. I don't think it killed off just the Clovis people. I think this is the cause of the loss of a whole episode of human civilization. This was a cataclysm gigantic enough to wipe out a whole civilization from memory. And when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, I couldn't say what the smoking gun was. I looked at a number of scenarios around the end of the Ice Age. This is a key piece of new evidence which makes the likelihood of a lost civilization extremely high. And in closing, I see Hugh about to come here and tell me I've got 5 minutes. In closing, let's just go back to Egypt and look at the Temple of Horus at Edfu, which is like one of those ancient maps, where an ancient document that was fragile and falling apart, but of great importance to the ancient Egyptians, was preserved by copying it. It was copied onto the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, and thus made permanent. And it's called the Edfu Building Texts. And it's a document that speaks of the homeland of the primeval ones, which was destroyed, an island actually, which was destroyed in a gigantic cataclysm and a flood, and many of the gods were drowned, which is an odd thing to happen to gods. But the survivors came to Egypt and settled in Egypt and established religion in Egypt and created the primeval mounds around which would be the site of all future temples and pyramids in Egypt. This is the story of the Edfu Building Texts. In other words, civilizing heroes, survivors of a cataclysm who bring knowledge and wisdom to a devastated world. Could they be a bit like the legend of Viracocha in the Andes? We see figures of Viracocha at Tiwanaku, and interestingly, he is profusely bearded which is very unusual to find in the peoples of the Andes. He looks like somebody from a different land or a different culture. On the side of this Viracocha pillar, there is a serpent. And again, I don't want to make too much of this, but this weird little creature, which is actually, I've turned it on its side here, is actually up here on the head of the figure, looks a whole lot like Toxodon. And Toxodon is an animal that went extinct in the Andes between 13,000 and 12,000 years ago. If this is Toxodon, then this statue is extremely ancient, much more ancient than archaeologists agree. And what about those stories of Quetzalcoatl and those white-skinned, bearded strangers who came in remote prehistory, bringing civilization to Central America and who were later driven out but promised to return? These bearded figures are found in the oldest archaeological strata of Mexico and are always associated with the imagery of the feathered serpent. It was said when Quetzalcoatl was driven out of Mexico that he fled on a raft of serpents, serpents woven together in a raft. And here at Göbekli Tepe, on one of the pillars, we have an image of serpents woven together in a net or a raft. Those are the heads and tails of the serpents. So the bearded figures from Mexico, which certainly do not look at all like indigenous American Indians. And if you look closely at the Easter Island figures, you can see that they're bearded as well, that those extravagant, huge chins are actually beards, and the beard is quite clear on a number of the figures. So I want to close with these bearded men and ask two questions. One, why is he wearing a fish on his head? And two, why is he carrying a man bag? These cute little man bags that we see here. Could it be his stash of DMT? I don't know. But it's interesting. The fish on the head, actually, we know about that. This figure represents a character in Babylonian and Sumerian myth, and he's called Oannes. And he is said to be a civilizer who survived the flood, who swam through the flood, emerged from the waters of the ocean, and brought civilization back to a devastated land. And the fish symbolism symbolizes his ability to survive the flood. But what about the man bag? And why is the feathered serpent carrying the same man bag, and indeed holding it in exactly the same way? It's not just the bag, it's the hand gesture as well. That's really interesting. This is the other side of the world. This is Mexico. The other one's from Sumer, Babylon. What's going on? Is it a coincidence, or is there some connection? Could we be looking at a badge of office of the survivors of a lost civilization here? And what makes that connection firmer to me is the fact that man bags are also found on the Göbekli Tepe pillars, where we know that they are 12,000 years old. There's a lot to look into here. I'm just really beginning this work, and I've just shared this evening some of the background and some of the tantalizing clues that intrigue me. I hope it's been of interest. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.